One opportunity I've used is publishing through The Conversation, which is a website that allows academics to present their research or research from their field in a more general way that reaches the general public. And so I think that's one way that we can reach the general public a lot more easily than in a journal article, but it also allows someone like me to collaborate with other academics when you're putting together that information, which isn't always as easy in sort of a formal research study. You have to wait until somebody's got the capacity, the time to do so, but when we collaborate on something like The Conversation, anybody can participate. It takes a few days to write an article and then it's done. I've also shared some of my research with other academics around the university, with school students. So often school students come to campus and want to find out a little bit about what university is about. And so different academics from different disciplines present little bits and pieces of what they do. So I usually present a lecture on how memory works, which is useful for Year 12 students going into exams, but hopefully it might be that little kernel of interest in one or two of their minds that thinks, yeah, I want to come and study education as well. So those are probably the main ways in which I've reached out.
And we've had several of our researchers, lecturers be invited to Parliament House, Canberra, go overseas. We had the recent CHOGM meeting, a lecturer from a researcher from our department, it's a professor, was actually invited to the CHOGM meeting. CHOGM was last year, I think. I forget. Whenever the most recent CHOGM meeting was, they had an entire day for a cultural forum, and he was actually invited all the way. He went all the way to Sri Lanka, and he took part in CHOGM itself. So yes, definitely economics research does open up just invitations to wider political fora, cultural fora, beyond just academic fora.
I mean, I teach a first year unit that's got 750 students. They're not all computing students. In fact, less than half of them, I'm sure. There's a lot of engineering students, but we also have art students and computer game students and media students. And so that's the closest thing I get to a wider audience. And I do really, really like that opportunity. I do really like the opportunity to plant the seed of interest in the topic. I don't really know how successful I am, but I enjoy the opportunity.
Lots of opportunities to talk to people who work in museums who haven't sort of really thought about how they would conceptualise the types of work that they do. And I find that that's particularly interesting in the area of science communication. So I've been in touch with quite a few groups who are interested in how you generate an interest in science through display work in museums. Found that's been particularly useful. I've also found it's been useful to talk to a lot of museums about how they develop a feeling of the significance of their own collections.
Discussing is mostly through conferences, or it can be like very narrow and specific conferences, but it can be very broad conferences, or speaking in public and invited by different foundations as well, talking about research on brain cancer, on breast cancer, on motor neuron disease, environmental factors. So you have to be able to actually to spread and explain your research in very late term to a lot of different people. And another thing I'm doing, actually, I'm a scientist in school for CSIRO, and I'm going to talk about the kid who wants to be a scientist. So I try to scare them as much as possible. And they say, like, at my level is what I'm doing. I'm a professional beggar. That's the word I say, to be honest. But I say it's still a good side of science. You have the freedom to be a scientist. You have to be able to just run your own project. It's amazing, but it's a very, very hard career these days. And it's really hard because of the limitation in money. So I'm honest with them and say it's a great job, freedom, but it's very hard because of the lack of money on the time you spend begging for money to do what you want to do.
The sort of work that I do does affect the teaching that goes on in churches, and so I do talk to people in my church about some of my work.
The opportunities that I've been afforded to speak about my research outside academia are really at industry conferences and forums. So I regularly attend industry conferences as well as academic conferences. And sometimes I'm invited and sometimes I'm not invited. But most of the time I'm an invited guest speaker, and that comes from my academic work, but also because people have got to know my work through social media. And as a result of that, they've got an industry conference, they'd like an academic, they select me because my research relates to the work that they're doing. It's also word of mouth as well. Sometimes there's a word of mouth issue. So I've presented, for example, at a number of train control conferences. I'm presenting at a power control conference in the next few weeks. And these are industry conferences. These are not academic conferences. So it's a very different clientele. It's a very different audience you're dealing with. They want practical solutions. But that's one opportunity. There are other opportunities I've had, which are opportunities to run training courses for people and the outcomes of my research. People want to know how to use the psychometric tools that I've developed. And that, again, has led to opportunities for research funding, because I'll run my training courses. People will be very interested in my training courses, and part of that is developing trust with an organisation. So they trust that you're going to do a good job, that you're well respected, that you can convey an interesting message, and then you might discuss the possibility of doing research together. And so that combination of the conference, industry conference, leading to a training course, then leading to research funding, is something I've pursued for many years and works very well.
Because of the discipline I'm in, which is the environmental sciences, it essentially is my obligation to effectively communicate the outputs of my research to multiple audiences. And so I have quite a lot of experience in doing that. So, for example, a lot of my research is applied to the Great Barrier Reef and Torres Strait. So I have very tight linkages with government agencies such as the Torres Strait Regional Authority and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And the way that I communicate with those organisations is through briefing papers, as well as briefings, meetings. Government loves meetings, so I go to a lot of meetings with government, and that's the way I communicate with them. I also like to communicate my research to a much wider audience, and that audience is sort of the general public. And I do that through articles in the conversation. So I've written essentially 4 articles for the conversation about my research and the topics that I'm interested in, primarily about the Great Barrier Reef.
Been lucky, I think, in that I've had several opportunities to communicate my research beyond an academic audience. It can range from things like going to talk to a group of teachers or a group of school students about some aspect of the curriculum or careers in history, something like that. I've appeared on television talking about my research, like on live television, and also produced sort of, magazine segment kind of television. I've been interviewed for historical documentaries about my work, and I've made a radio documentary about my work, as well as appearing on radio to just, tell us about Blue Hills, this radio program or whatever. So I've done quite a bit of that over the years. But those have been opportunities that I've sought out, I think. Not everybody, I'm lucky in that what I work on is post-war Australian social and cultural history. So that's stuff that is radio ready. There's a radio audience for that kind of stuff.
One of the challenges of communicating your research to an audience outside academia is just the one of translating what might have taken you 3 years or 1 year to write and research into a 10-minute talk that can be understood by lay people. But that is also a fantastic discipline, because if you can do that, then you can be really reassured that you understand the topic and that you know what you're talking about.
One of the biggest challenges that I find in communicating my research findings to the general public is in generating a sense of relevance to the public. So I am researching in the area of screen production, and a lot of people think, oh, it's just a movie, I'll just watch a movie kind of thing. So it's very interesting to me to try to spark questions in the minds of the general public, or to raise ideas in ways that get them to think further or think more deeply or do more exploration on their own even if they're not specialists. And I actually enjoy doing that. I like writing journalistically, if you will, as well as publishing academically.
Challenges to communicating outside academia is obviously to make your language accessible and to not bore your audience or talk about irrelevant academic issues. So the key there is to really put yourself in the shoes of your audience and to say, all right, well, what would I like to hear from this person? What can they offer me to take away to my practice and to help me improve what I'm doing?
One of the challenge talking to different people on broad audiences, especially to patients again, they want to know always one thing: when we get a cure. It's always the challenge answering this question. We have to explain that science takes time. We only can go step by step. The full disease is so complicated. We have to get little piece of the puzzle time after time. And they always come back to this question: when can I get a treatment? How soon? You have anything I can try? We work on disease-killing patients very quickly, so they want to try anything we have in a lab. We are not allowed to do that, unfortunately. But that's always a question. The challenging question is, can we get a treatment out of your work, and how soon?
You know, one of the challenges is, I find, looking back, is the importance of keeping language simple. I use a lot of storytelling in my book, Breast Cancer Taking. All my books, I have patient stories, for example, where they tell their story. So it's very powerful that a patient can write their story. And I then tell stories using a lot of metaphors. So I use a lot of tree examples, mountain examples, weed examples, and talk about cancer as being a weed under a rose bush, which is the breast. We need to decide whether to use a small spade to remove the weed or a big spade, which is like having a mastectomy. Chemotherapy becomes weed killer for the rest of the garden. Radiotherapy, which is my craft, is like weed mulch. When you pull the weeds out, why do I need radiotherapy? Well, you put weed mulch down to stop the seed coming back. So I think one of the challenges, I think, for all of us as academics is how to speak clearly to patients, not look down on them, talk to them as a normal human being, introduce some humour into it, introduce metaphors and stories, and I think that's how you hit the sweet spot. And you've got to be really careful working with traditional media, particularly live media. Live radio interviews or live TV interviews are some of the hardest things you've got to do, particularly live TV. So when Kylie Minogue got diagnosed with breast cancer, I had probably the biggest media day I've ever had in my life. I probably did 20 radio interviews, had 5 television trucks outside of my institute, and I had to do at least one live TV interview, which is live. So you can't muck it up. Okay.
So over-preparing is often a problem. Someone wants you to speak for 5 minutes about something. They've got 10 minutes before the news and you're so interested and you've got all this stuff to say and they don't ask you half of it. And, there's questions that it's kind of time consuming. The deadlines that media have are really short. So, they say, oh, we want an op-ed piece and we need it tomorrow. And you're like, but I've got to write a lecture between now and tomorrow. So there's a kind of question of different timescales and time frames that are difficult.
Well, the biggest challenge is keep my language simple, get rid of the technical terms, keep any discussions non-complicated, because we academics have to get involved in discussions and the caveats. So I've got to remove some of the caveats, make my discussions short, and then I've got to be prepared to make a decision on a matter. And that's actually the hardest part, is saying I'm going to say, yes, I believe this, or this I'm going to say is the best way to look at it.
There are 2 challenges, I think, to communicating the outcomes of research more broadly. The first is ensuring that you know your audience. We sometimes overpitch our work, assuming that the audience has the background that our academic colleagues do, and they just simply don't. But the second challenge, I think, is to ensure that you don't simplify to too much of an extent the outcomes of your research. And the outcomes of research are not necessarily black and white. There are lots of greys, and in particular in psychology, and trying to convey the ambiguity, the difficulty is important, and it's also confronting because we have to acknowledge the fact that we haven't actually nailed the answer to this question yet. And it's always difficult when you have to admit, I don't know the answer to that question, and I feel bad every time I have to say that, but that's what I have to say sometimes. And I think that's a real challenge, is trying to make sure that we communicate with the broader population that there are difficulties and complexities in what we do as well.
I mean, I have had one particular opportunity. I got to speak to a journalist from the Herald years ago about my artificial intelligence research. It's good to be able to talk to someone outside your field, especially someone who is wanting to create a story for you. That's very, very useful. They're experts at it, and they listen to what you say, and you go back and forth, and then they write something down, something that other people do find interesting. The challenge, though, of course, is whether it's accurate or not. And even in that case, it was a very simple thing, but even in that case, I'm reading it going, I'm just not real happy with the accuracy here. But that's probably a factor of being an academic, where accuracy is everything.
It's much easier to get something out into the social media sphere and read and published than it is to get your research published. But like I said at the beginning, you don't want to take that academic challenge and shy away from it. You know, you have to embrace it and learn from it. And you know, peer reviewing, you get your paper back and it's been critiqued, and you just want to lie on the floor and cry and give up and say, I can't do this, is too hard, I don't understand what they want, why, that's wrong. And then you pick yourself up and, you spend another month working on it. That just doesn't happen when you're publishing anything, or talking in the social media spheres. It's just, you're just churning out content, hopefully high quality content, but if it's not high quality that particular time, well, no one's going to tell you. So very different challenges across you're wearing two hats. I think you need to be really conscious that you're a different person to an extent, and you're wearing two hats. And
I really enjoy communicating outside of academia because it actually helps me disseminate my work to practitioners and gives me a link between reality and academia. Often we're accused of sitting in academic ivory towers and really not knowing what goes on in practice. However, when I give a talk to accounting professionals, and I know that talk resonates with them, and after those talks we mingle and we actually talk about the impact of what I've actually had to say. And these issues are generally very current with what's actually happening in practice, in accounting practice. So it's a really great way for me to know that my research is A, relevant, B, getting understood, and C, is actually being used in practice in the future, because I know that a lot of my writing and a lot of the research that I've actually presented is actually being used by accounting professionals.
And what I enjoy about communicating with non-academics is that they really ask me the difficult questions, not about reliability and validity, but why does this work? Why should we believe you that this will work in this context? And I think that makes us think. That challenges us to do more research, better research, different research to answer those important questions. And I think that's wonderful.
Making a radio feature, that was a major piece of creative and research output for me. That was a really important way to say something that I felt was important to a contemporary audience, and taking something, a Royal Commission that was done in the 1970s, and making that speak to a contemporary audience in a way that resonated with some people was really rewarding. You don't always get opportunities like that because your research doesn't always speak to the moment in the way that did, but that was really enjoyable because it was working in a slightly different register. I mean, academic work is very much about making arguments and offering interpretations, and this was doing that, but also working in a slightly emotional, affective register as well, and that was really interesting, and I learned a lot from the really experienced people that I worked with, like things like how to use music, how to make pacing and mood kind of work for an audience. So that was really, really interesting and very different, not something that you would normally get from academic research.
In talking to a broader audience, you really have to go back and think about what's important about what you're doing and why it matters and what's so interesting about it. I think it often gives you a chance to come back to the nuts and bolts of what you love When you're working on a particular research project, you're often working at a very kind of high level at quite a small problem often, whereas talking to a general audience lets you get back in touch with your broader field and lets you kind of engage with the ideas that made you passionate in the first place. So I think I really like that aspect.
Yeah, I think it's just the randomness of it. It's just you're sending your work out there and you're waiting for an engagement, and it'll always surprise you or please you, or sometimes it dismays you and you think, well, you know, sometimes I've looked at the comments, say, on the conversation, and the comments can be really pretty low quality, and you know, you walk away despairing. But I guess that's just part of getting used to the fact that the world is a very diverse place and not everyone's wants to listen to you in the way that you want to be listened to, which is the kind of reality check that you need.
So what I like about doing that is that it just helps confirm that I'm not just doing research for research's sake, that somebody somewhere is interested in what I'm doing and it has an impact on their work and on the lives of real people.